This is the web transmission service of the Royal Canadian Military Institute. The Institute kicked off its fall 2023 lecture season on Wednesday, September the 13th, with an address to Military History Night by RCMI Museum Curator and Director Ryan Goldsworthy on Canada's 100 Days.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the first Military History Night of the fall. I'm the event chair, James Ellis. I hope everyone had a great summer, and it's fantastic to see such a big turnout for this evening's event. I'm very, very excited. We have a series of terrific speakers lined up, starting with our speaker this evening. His presentation is about one of the most important and iconic events in Canadian military history. And we have a very special treat. In addition to his presentation, he is going to be showing off some remarkable First World War artifacts here. He really needs no introduction to the members here, as he is the RCMI's Museum Director and Curator. Can you please give a warm hand to Ryan Goldsworthy?
How's everyone doing tonight? Okay? Yeah? Did you enjoy dinner?
Yes.
Excellent. Well, guys, I won't lecture at you for too long this evening, but this is an important topic, an important event. It's actually the 105th anniversary of Canada's 100 Days this month, so I know 105 isn't the nice round sexy number that 100 is, but I think it's still important regardless of the anniversary date. So I'll just be talking for about 30 minutes or so, and then I'm happy to take some questions afterwards. Anything you're burning to ask me about the topic, about the awesome objects that we've brought up. My museum associate, Harrison Kennedy, at the front row here. He'll be on hand if anyone wants to come and see an intimate view of the objects afterwards. We even have some gloves if you'd like to touch them. That's the sort of experience we like to provide at the RCMI. So again, thank you for being here. And I'm going to kick it off now. So this topic, before I sort of get into the meat of it, I actually wrote an article with my esteemed colleague, Dr. Jack Granitstein, who is also the honorary historian of RCMI. He's not able to be here tonight, but he wanted to say hello to everyone, and he expresses his goodwill and support for this topic. So if you want to see our paper that we co-authored in the last edition of the Canadian Military History Journal, you can check it out. It's free, it's online, it's through Laurier's publication. So take a look if you're interested to know a little more and about some of the sources that we used. It's a great piece. Excellent. So I know off the get-go, James said that the 100 Days is an iconic event in Canada's military history, and he's not wrong. But what I would say is that it's lesser known compared to many of the battles of Canadian military history. I think you'd agree with me when I say that Vimy is the one battle that most Canadians will know. Some will be familiar with Passchendaele, D-Day, maybe the Somme, the disasters at Hong Kong and Dieppe. You know, this room's knowledge notwithstanding, this is really the average Canadian's view on military history. The 100 Days are really not on the radar. The 100 Days really encapsulates the Canadian Corps' extraordinary run of victories from the 8th of August 1918 through to the armistice of the 11th of November. Outside of institutions like this one, like the Canadian War Museum, 100 Days does not receive similar commemorative attention in Canada as Vimy or as D-Day. No films or foundations have been commissioned, and the 8th of August passes with very little fanfare each year. As I mentioned, this month, from August until November, marks the 105th, but like its centenary, passing with minimal commemoration. I would contend that Canadians should know the 100 Days because the battles that constitute that offensive were almost certainly the most important battles ever won by Canadian soldiers. This is a great photo here. It's actually a very rare photo from what you'll see compared to other First World War photographs. This actually depicts the Canadians in combat on the outskirts of Valenciennes on the 1st of November 1918. And the platoon there that's sort of running into the wall section there, they're most likely from the 38th Battalion, and that's why I chose this jacket here. Other members will know and who have heard my talks in the past that the RCMI actually maintains the most complete collection of CDF uniforms in existence. So this is a great example that I brought up, and it matches the very jackets that are being worn in that photo. So it's a great piece, and I invite you to take a closer look when I'm done speaking. So the 100 Days was the Allies' final and war-winning campaign, and one in which Canada played a leading and decisive role. And I can't stress that enough. In most cases of these more famous, Canada played an important part, but we were essentially on the winning team. In the 100 Days, we were the spearhead, and Canada really was that decisive formation that helped to bring the First World War to a close for the Allies. So the Canadians actually carried a very disproportionate weight in those victories of the waning months, where they defeated roughly 1/4 of the German army, if you can believe it. In fact, in the war's final 96 days, the Canadian Corps advanced 140 kilometers, which outstripped all the previous years of Allied advances, and it also blows away the concepts and the stereotypes of a trench stalemate. It was a highly mobile, highly rapid style of warfare. The thing about the 100 Days, too, that we also must stress is that unlike Vimy, unlike Passchendaele, the more famous names, the 100 Days were unquestionably meaningful in bringing about the ultimate German capitulation in 1918. En route of this unparalleled advance, the Canadians also steadily liberated much of northern France and Belgium, which included a remarkable 228 cities, towns, and villages. Now keep in mind, Germany had occupied France and Belgium for almost 50 months at this point, where civilians lived under brutal military government and martial law, and many of the letters of Canadian soldiers, many of which we maintain here at the RCMI, reveal the Canadian soldiers' contempt and their anger at the Germans as these conditions were revealed. In 1918, the retreating Germans burned farms and homes, they destroyed roads and bridges, they planted booby traps that maimed soldiers and civilians alike, they deliberately wrecked the economy, and they looted everything of value. Canada's important role in liberating parts of Western Europe in 1918 is yet another forgotten chapter, which has largely been overshadowed by the liberations in the Second World War 25 years later. So this really leaves us with one pressing question, which will be the main source of my talk this evening, which is, how did this Canadian Corps of about 103,000 men and officers defeat the greatest land army at the time and bring the then largest conflict to an end? So before I get into those reasons, which I'll rattle off fairly succinctly, I think we must also just understand the context of 19 a little bit, where the Allies were, where Canada was, why we were thrust into this spearhead role as such a small country. I mean, keep in mind, in 1918, Canada had only about 8 million people, fighting arm of the CDF of 100,000 men, and now we're facing down the greatest European power, and it's an incredible story that follows. So keep in mind, the Canada had begun the First World War as amateurs. We all know the story. this small national formation, we faced this brutalizing learning curve on the Western Front. We fought gallantly and costly but largely futile attacks in 1915 and 1916. This changed in September of 1916 near a little French town called Courcelette, where Canada faced its first real taste of battlefield victory. And I just want to give you two takeaways from Courcelette that you'll never forget, because what is it otherwise other than a place name in France somewhere? So number one, it was the first time that creeping barrage was successfully employed on the battlefield, which was a decisive artillery tactic on their Western Front, which basically called curtains of the Allies' own artillery shells in front of the advancing infantry to cover the advance and smash the German defenses. And we also introduced tanks at Courcelette for the first time. So it was effectively a precursor of the combined arms operations, which would typify the monumental success of 1918. So 7 months later came Vimy. And Vimy's most important tactical legacy was that it provided the Canadians with an excellent model on how to prepare and execute a set-piece attack. The Canadians became masters of the set piece, and the Canadian Corps' most decisive victories of the 100 Days were all derivative of that set piece style. The other victories of 1917, Hill 70, Passchendaele, also reaffirmed the importance of thorough preparation, well-defined objectives, and operation-learned soldiers from all ranks. Very important things for the victories ahead. So fortuitously, the Canadian positions near Lens and Vimy were left relatively unscathed following the German spring offensive of 1918, which had allowed the Corps to replenish its ranks and to commit to the training for the open warfare which was to come. At the same time, the Germans, who were exhausted after 4 years of fighting, primarily a war on two fronts, and fresh from their failed spring offensive, were suffering greatly from food and material shortages. Many of its best units in the line were described by one German major as having been utterly burnt out. They were in a very vulnerable position, and Canada, with the support of its allies, were about to deliver the knockout blow. As for the remaining allies, they weren't in ideal shape. And I'll run through all of them very quickly here. So, the French were exhausted. They had recently suffered another 500,000 casualties in that desperate defense against the Germans in the spring of 1918. The Germans, of course, came within 90 kilometers of Paris, which is dangerously close. As a result, the British Empire forces would take the leading role in the war's final months. Then you have the Aussies. They were just as capable as the Canadians, but without national conscription like Canada, they were unable to replenish the losses that they sustained so heavily in August and were forced to pull back. Meanwhile, you have the British Army. And unfortunately, the British government was worried about the political effect, if you can believe it, of more casualties. And pressure mounted for Douglas Haig's removal at every British casualty that ensued. Haig, as a result, will lean heavily on the Canadians in the final months of the war. And I know I have some American visitors here as well, so I would be remiss if I didn't mention their involvement as well. And the American Expeditionary Force, of course, led by John Pershing, they arrived at the front late, only in 1918. And the truth was they were inexperienced, and they weren't ready to be taking on such a prominent role in the offensive or to be as effective as they needed to be until at least 1919, 1920. So, fell to Canada. And Canada was well rested. We were very reliable. The Canadian Corps was actually the only formation on the Western Front never to lose a battle in the final 2 years of the war. Think how considerable that is. In this photo here, we have Prince of Connaught. Left to right here, we all know General Currie, who, of course, if you look at the photo, is the only officer without a mustache and without a crook cane. So his idiosyncrasies, I would say, actually for whatever reason, permitted him to be one of the ablest generals on the Western Front, but that's a talk for another day. So I'm going to basically highlight three big reasons why Canada was able to do this. How were they able to pull it off? 4 divisions against 47 German divisions. It's incredible. So the first of which, tactics of the infantry, the doctrine, the equipment. We'll talk a little bit about the artifacts, how that ties into it as well. The fact too that the 4 Canadian divisions fought together, they believed they could not be beaten, and they were the best formation in the British Expeditionary Force. It was of immeasurable importance. You cannot quantify that confidence, that feeling of invincibility. At Passchendaele, and this is the portrait up here on the big screen, we have some of his ancestors in the crowd right now. This is Captain Alfred Hannaford, who was a Vimy Military Cross winner. You can see his medal set, which is on display on the second floor of the RCMI. And he would write proudly to his father in Montreal, the Canadians have a great name over here. We're considered the best attacking troops in the British Army, and consequently, we get lots of work. The Germans, too, considered the Canadians to be extremely effective, and whenever their intelligence reported that Canadians were in the line, they came to expect an attack. By the spring of 1918, while the German offensives continued, Currie's soldiers had begun training for open warfare. In repeated exercises, the soldiers practiced what became to be called combined arms warfare. That's a key term to all of this, combined arms warfare. This essentially put together infantry, artillery, machine guns, armor, and the air power in ways that had never before been fully exploited. The Canadians also used sudden artillery bombardments, tanks, which cooperated with supporting air squadrons. The newly formed Royal Air Force had improved its ability to communicate with troops on the ground, which is obviously a great value in reconnaissance, attacks on enemy positions, and in directing and correcting the aim of the artillery. And we'll get into artillery as my second of 3 points in just a second. But one statistic to take away from this, and I'm not going to throw numbers at you, but it's amazing that 90% of all the artillery fire, all the Canadians' artillery fire at this point by 1917 was being directed by the air. It's incredible, the relationship between the artillery and the air power. And we're going to talk a little bit more about that in just a second. So the Canadians used, all of these tactics, indirect fire of their machine guns, fire and movement of the infantry. Battalions of the same brigade were leapfrogging each other, so fresh ones would be overtaking exhausted units. And whenever possible, they relied on deception, tactical surprise. Canadian divisions were also much larger and contained more firepower than both British or their German counterparts. Canadian infantry companies and platoons were further reorganized to keep these new tactics practical, and operational success depended on company and platoon leadership. The junior officers and the NCOs, now carrying much more responsibility, had been privates only a year or two before. Take Captain Hannaford here. He enlisted in January 1915 as a private, and by November of 1916 he had been promoted as an officer. He was a lieutenant. And it was these promotions through meritocracy that really differentiated the Canadians to the British or German or French counterparts, because we didn't have this unsustainable model of peerage and breeding, rotting the inside out of our leadership, but rather these were men who had proven themselves in battle and were promoted or selected based on what they were able to achieve on battle. So it's a remarkable achievement, and I would even go as far to say that the Canadians cultivated the best leadership structure on the Western Front, period. So this is my second of 3 here, and we have to section it out just because of how important it is, so stay with me on this. So I would say perhaps the single most important tactical arm driving the Canadians to the run of dramatic victories in 1918 was the artillery. And anyone who's heard my talks before has probably heard me mention this, but just stay with me on a couple of points. So approximately 60 to 70% of all casualties in the First World War were caused as a result of the artillery. The war is often referred to as the Gunners' War for good reason. So Allied infantry and tanks, despite improved tactics and doctrine that I just talked a little bit about, they could not successfully move across the field without the artillery's close support, period. The Canadians were ingenious in their use of artillery tactics. While the field artillery's creeping barrages, as I mentioned, suppressed enemy infantry, motor, and small arms fire, the counter battery staff office simultaneously suppressed the enemy artillery. Counter battery basically was a chess match. Canadian guns knocking out German guns, so they weren't going to cause any problems to our infantry getting across the field. It's this counter battery, or this targeted destruction of enemy artillery, which was the gunners' seminal contribution to the 100 Days and in winning the war. And I can't stress that enough. So from January 1917, Lieutenant Colonel Andrew McNaughton, who you can see on the big board there with his 2 wound stripes on the cuff, was appointed as the counter battery staff officer. Basically, he was in charge of all the Canadians' counter battery efforts. As a result, he and his staff, you can't forget the staff. I mean, the big names, the Currys, the McNaughtons, they always get the credit, but it's the officers, the junior officers, who all contribute to this. The staff developed complex mathematical equations for better calculating the fall of shot of their guns, which was known as artillery or counter battery science. And they also developed tactics to better identify and target German artillery batteries on the field. So it was incredible work, and it can't be stressed enough. So the heavy but precise opening artillery bombardments at the start of the 100 Days, they decimated all the German outposts, all their forward defensive. And it was so effective that, quote, the German artillery batteries were wiped from the face of battle. This was, of course, on the 8th of August at the decisive Battle of Amiens, which the Germans later called the Black Day of the German Army. McNaughton would later cheekily report about the events at Amiens. It appears we have swamped his batteries. At the Canal du Nord in September the 27th, the anniversary of that is coming up. The Canadian Corps enacted its most daring action of the entire war, which was enabled by the artillery. So basically what happened at the canal, for those who might be unfamiliar, is the Canadians selected this area to cross into German territory, which was an unfinished concrete canal in that area of France. And the problem with doing so is that the Germans had lighter defenses in that area, but at the same time, by using that narrow corridor to cross, which the engineers had to develop bridges to throw over the unfinished concrete, you're basically bottlenecking 50,000 men into a narrow corridor. So if the German artillery has any intelligence or sense that this is where we're amassing the men, it's a disaster, it's a slaughter. The Canadians are essentially wiped out in this one moment in time. This is why it's so daring, this is why it's so important. And this is why the artillery is so important in that role, is knocking out the German batteries before they can even come into firing to enable the infantry to move across in that narrow defile formation. So one quote I pulled out about how effective and how powerful that the Canadian bombardment was prior to that crossing at the canal. It comes from a gunner, Harold Henry Simpson of the 2nd Brigade Canadian Garrison Artillery, and he wrote, it was like the same day, so it's incredible. He writes, "Believe me, it was some barrage. It was a grand sight. We could see our troops advancing steadily behind our barrage. It was a great day." For the last major Canadian operation of the war at Valenciennes in November, This is where you saw the photo a couple slides ago of the 38th Battalion storming in. The Canadians would devise an attack centered on completely overpowering the enemy with their artillery. The Canadians essentially stacked the deck. They amassed 256 guns and howitzers, which fired 4,200 tons of ammunition on a front of only 2,000 yards. It was only a 2-day battle. The Canadians suffered a total of 500 casualties, which in modern terms sounds like a lot. But it was only 60 killed, compared to the Germans, who sustained over 2,200 casualties with 800 killed, and they had a defensible position. One German company commander lamented at Valenciennes that because of the intensity of this multi-directional Canadian bombardment, quote, it was impossible to see or even know from which direction the attackers, Canadians, were coming. The Canadian artillery had adhered to Currie's ultimate order of paying for this victory in shells and not in life. And you can similarly see this with this quote that I provided with McNaughton on the board. And it really was, the artillery's object to save lives, to enable the infantry to cross. You sometimes come across this egotistical view of the First World War where, the artillery conquers, but the infantry occupies. But the greatest artillery officers didn't see that at all, really. They were a tool in this grander picture, one piece of a larger puzzle. And their job, first and foremost, was to enable the Canadian infantry to move across relatively unmolested. And this is why it's so important. Infantry saved by the artillery. I think it's funny, when you look at the two commanders of the Canadian Army, the First Canadian Army in the Second World War, Harry Curator and our friend Aaron McNaughton, they were both senior artillery officers from the First World War. So we can see how they rose through the ranks based on their success in delivering these blows in the First World War. So my last point here before the conclusion, so just stay with me. So in analyzing all these reasons for the Canadian successes, we've looked at the more exciting aspects: tactics, doctrine, infantry, tanks, aircraft, the artillery. But the truth is, we have to look at the logistical achievements. So these four large, oversized Canadian divisions were fully manned and resourced for the final offensive of 1918. But this advantage required monumental logistical preparation and maneuvering. The logistics of moving the Canadian Corps' men and resources, both in the lead up to battle and as the fighting was ongoing, was a constant concern. It was paramount to the success or the failure of any operation. So the speed, as I mentioned from the beginning, this was a rapid mobile warfare. You can see the engineers here, they're laying down roads basically as fast as the men could move. And the speed really necessitated an equally and fast and supportive logistical supply line. It's a monumental challenge. It took tens of thousands of men. So for one, I'll say this because they don't get enough credit, is the CEF actually possessed the best railway troops in the world. Recall, Canada's only about 50 years outside of Confederation at this point. We got railways now tying the entire Dominion together. The best railway men in the world, through experience and training, were recruited from railway firms in Canada. They brought them over to the Western Front. We laid over 4,000 kilometers of tracks from April 1917 at Vimy to the end of the war. In fact, Canada was so successful in laying all these railway tracks, we covered the entire British sector on the Western Front. The British basically handed it off to us. It's incredible. And I point to a medal set, actually. It's a very rare medal set on the table, named to a Sergeant Biggs, who was a Canadian railway train man who served with great distinction, won a Meritorious Service Medal in 1917. And that's just one little snapshot of why the CEF is so successful. It's these logistical parts of it that do not get enough coverage. So like the railways, the Canadian logistics had similarly been revamped into a very smooth running organization under a General D.G. Farmer. I just wanted to give him that name credit because he's not among the Curries of the world. But Currie trusted him as his quartermaster general and to organize these monumental tasks of moving men, resources, laying roads, the massive amount of not only building it but maintaining it, moving it tens and hundreds of kilometers. It's an incredible feat, especially in wartime when, like, these towns, you can see the silhouette behind them. The city's been obliterated by artillery. They had to put roads and railways through this carnage. It's incredible. Even in peacetime, it would be an amazing achievement. So in concert with all this, we had a fully motorized Army Service Corps, which we were the only formation that had this. Not even the British had a fully motorized Service Corps. And they were able to transport hundreds of bulky guns, tens of thousands of men and beasts. We got 50,000 horses and mules, the mighty mules, moving resources and pulling guns. We got to move millions of munitions to the front at MENs without, alerting the Germans to this presence. As I mentioned earlier, every time the Germans, they see the Canadians moving, they see us moving to the line, they expect an attack. So we have to conceal what we're doing. Up until August of 8th, we're moving all these resources, tens of thousands of men, animals, munitions, in the cover of darkness, and the Germans never figured it out. So that's another credit to the logistics of the CEF. So the great challenges I'm talking about, this is all movement, before the battle, getting everything to the front. There's also great challenges of movement as the battle progressed. Like the first day at MENs on 8th of August, the Canadians advanced 13 kilometers. Imagine how many roads and tracks and guns you have to pull just to stay up with the front, stay up with the men, get munitions to them, food, etc. So they solved this primarily, and our President Mike Clary will like this, through feats of combat engineering. So at the Canal du Nord that I mentioned, the Canadian Corps' engineering resources were committing to maintaining the transportation of routes and bridging the canal as fast as they could, so you can get these 50,000 men across before they'd be obliterated by German artillery. The engineers provided the highest possible mobility for the Corps by constructing 17 major bridges there. This is all completed in a matter of days or hours. They had pontoons, like moving them across wet parts of the field where it had been rained out the day previous. So quickly advancing these supply and transportation lines was crucial to consolidating newly captured ground, and the lifting of mines, the elimination of booby traps, which the Germans were famous for or infamous for, helped to facilitate the infantry's continuous advance in an environment of complete devastation, as you can tell in this one photo. The result of the engineers' dedicated labor and expertise spared the infantry from these tasks as well, so they're not having to lay down the road, dig ditches, etc., so they're more fresh for the fighting that they're focusing on. And this really established the foundation for one of the Corps' most decisive victories of the 100 Days at the Canal. And let me say this before I conclude, is that a healthy supply line and the overall success of the 100 Days were inextricably linked. You cannot have, these very dashing and exciting movements of men and tanks without the supply line, without the combat engineering. So I'm going to wrap up here. So the war on the Western Front ended at Mons, Belgium, which was a highly symbolic prize, and as mentioned, after 50 months of German occupation, the Canadian Corps fired the final shots of the First World War. Contrary to post-war propaganda and the anti-Semitic stab-in-the-back myth, which eventually led to the rise of the Third Reich, the German army had been decisively defeated in the field. But in a few words, how did the Canadians do it? The Canadian experiences in the battles from 1915 to 1917 taught the Corps how to fight and win against the German army on the Western Front. The Corps mastered the set-piece attack. It had successfully employed combined arms operations. It had best refined and defined its unit organization, equipment, and doctrine, and it had cultivated, through meritocracy, experience, and training, as mentioned, perhaps the finest leadership structure on the Western Front. Tactically, the Canadian infantry, machine gunners, cavalry, tanks, and armored cars were supported by an advanced and powerful artillery, which largely crushed the enemy from the opening barrage at Amiens through to the armistice. The artillery, in turn, was empowered on the back of its intimate and revolutionary relationship with the air power. At the back end, the logistics and engineers provided the fighting arm of the CEF with requisite material and movement. As the final Allied offensives spearhead with replenishable manpower and with near unmatched firepower, experience, ingenuity, organization, leadership, reputation, and material resources, the Canadian Corps was the decisive, war-winning formation on the Western Front, period. It was exactly as Major General David Watson wrote in his diary on the date of armistice. After 4 years of war, we gained complete victory over the enemy. It was, however, the men on the ground who ultimately delivered the final victory. We can see them here with the capture of Mons in that town square, which still looks eerily similar to how it was did in 1918, for those who have been there. For their leading role in the offensive, the Canadian casualties of the 100 Days amounted to 45,835, which is the highest casualty rate in the nation's military history. Among the Canadian war dead was Captain Alfred Hannaford, who you saw earlier, who died of his wounds near Cambrai only a month before the armistice. Hannaford's commanding officer would write to his father, "There was no more beloved an officer in the Canadian Corps." Each one of those 45,835 was felt. And I'll close on this, and it really comes back to why I'm doing this talk, why I'm trying to get the word out there even more, is that the 100 Days, I don't think, it doesn't naturally lend itself well to commemoration or to memory in the same way as Vimy or D-Day. I think those two comparable examples are better marked by more monolithic or ubiquitous names, Vimy, D-Day, with specific dates, as opposed to a months-long offensive, which is more of a mouthful. In popular memory, the 100 Days, ending with the armistice, was likely absorbed into the collective national grief, which became Armistice and later Remembrance Day. Canada's 100 Days, inclusive of its battles at Amiens, Drocourt-Quéant, Canal du Nord, Cambrai, Valenciennes, and Mons, deserves to be better remembered by Canadians and by wider international scholarship. The 100 Days were the nation's greatest and most decisive military victory. Thank you.
So, questions?
Coming from a cavalry family, it behooves me to ask the questions of how the mounted troopers, aka cavalry, were used in the myriad nature of these 100 days of attacks.
Thanks, Paul, for that question. I think with the cavalry, for those who have seen War Horse and all these other stereotypes of cavalry in the First World War, is that the cavalrymen, after 1914, were largely phased out. They seem almost antiquated to the modern battlefields. The Lord Strathcona's horse were not remounted until 1916, but it's a great question because the great story about the cavalry is they gain renewed importance in the 100 Days because it's such a rapid and mobile warfare. The cavalrymen are actually able to move much quicker to consolidate ground. The idea of a more surprise attack that the Canadians were developing at Amiens, they can move much quicker over German lines to crash over them. They're also highly used in rearguard actions, so they can quickly move back and forth, consolidate positions, set up Hotchkiss machine gun emplacements much faster than a man can move on foot. So I think it's that nature of the 100 Days, how rapid it was, how mobile it was, that provided renewed importance to the cavalry and all of those aspects.
Just a quick question. I understand the First World War, the ending of it, the Allies end up in France. The mistake, I think, was we didn't push on into Germany and we allowed an armistice. And I understand you said the German army was defeated in the field, but I'm not sure the German people, unlike the Second World War, when Allied soldiers are deep in Germany, even the simplest German understands they've lost the war. But so long as the defeat of the German army is in the field in France, did we not make a mistake by not continuing the 100 days to 130 or 150 days and going all the way to Berlin?
Yeah, thanks for your comments. There's absolutely some truth to your statement, and many of the officers understood it at the time as well. You know, they ended in Mons, Belgium, and they actually had only advanced to the point where the British Army had been routed in 1914, so they really only brought it back to the starting line. MacNaughton himself actually has a quote where he says, "Unless we push them back at the point of a bayonet, we're going to be back here in 20 years." So it's not as if many of the officers didn't understand it at the time. Was it a mistake? That's difficult to ascertain because nobody then, even if they had those thoughts, had a crystal ball. And essentially it was a mercy ending the war then, because they could continue to pursue a defeated enemy all the way back to Germany. You could pound Berlin and forcibly make them sign a unconditional surrender. But how many more hundreds of thousands of casualties, civilian and military, are caused in that? So I think that was a major reason for signing this armistice as a mercy to the millions of men and women who had already been killed to that point. So I think that was really the foundation of reasoning. And the Prussians were bad, like, make no mistake, but they weren't the fanatics that were the Nazis. And they were at least willing to accept surrender. The officers knew, even though the people didn't, and that's why these myths persisted. The Jews, they stabbed us in the back, while we were fighting in the front. All complete crap. But they were able to use this myth, but the officers knew it was over. The men were defeated. They were, the only thing holding the Canadians back, if anything, was how they were destroying every ground. I mean, the Canadians had to rebuild roads, railways, as mentioned. They left everything in desolation. They were burning towns and farms to cover their tracks as they retreated. So they were, in every sense, defeated, even though the civilians and some of the other ranks couldn't see it.
Ryan, we have excellent plans, well executed by a skillful organization. But I'm wondering, can you find something actually unique about the techniques of the Canadians? Was it the division structure? Was it handing out maps? But anything unique?
I would say, thanks, Bob. So what I would say about this is the Canadian Corps, there's a uniqueness to their quality. Because the truth is that they're great innovators. They show great ingenuity. So the most forward-thinking leaders that they had, the MacNaughtons, the Curries, the Farmars, they studied what other armies were doing. They were great researchers, and they knew how to apply tactics, tweak them, and then pile on every aspect to perfecting it. So there are a few things that they did that were wholly unique, but I think they just did so many things better than the other formations. If we're talking about truly unique aspects, the leadership promotional system was huge. I mean, the British Army and the French Army eventually came along, but I think it was too late by that point. You know, famously, Arthur Currie, with his failed real estate developments, he even stole money from the regiment to pay off bad debts. He's not someone who ever would have been promoted beyond field rank. So these men were able to, in Canada, they didn't have these, you know, there was a few, but they didn't have these areas of patronage, of peerage, they weren't like Oxford and Cambridge graduates, but you had these men of merit who were able to ascend through the ranks. So that's one. Two is this commitment to education that I don't see in any other formation. You mentioned the maps. Canadians were first to do that. I could talk forever about all of this, and I'll spare you. But at Vimy, this is it seems almost obvious now, but it was revolutionary for the time. The Canadians disseminated 40,000 maps, not just to officers, but all the men as well. So every single man, down to the private level, knew exactly what their role was. They understood the terrain, they understood their specific objectives, and they trained on it for days, sometimes months. So these operation-learned soldiers, and not withholding information from the men, not blindly attacking. Because what happens when your lieutenant gets killed? It runs into disorganization and chaos. But when the NCOs, the enlisted men, are just as learned on what they have to do, they can continue. They can continue on the advance. So education, promotion, and I think putting the combined arms together like no one else was able to. Some of the best British divisions were able to attempt combined arms, but the Canadians just did it better. I mean, MacNaughton was the first Army officer in history, period. He was the first Army officer to command air assets from the ground. And I think how, like, you know, synonymous that is today, how harmonious. But then the aircraft, the air power was not so seamlessly integrated into arms, into operations. But MacNaughton had like a squadron of light bombers placed directly under his command. So if his guns couldn't take out a German battery, he could dispatch RAF bombers to take out. It gave him much longer reach. So, in all the ingenuity and innovation, I would point to those three things: education and training, promotion, and combined arms and cooperation with the air power, as no one else was doing.
More of a comment than a question, but you may have further comments. I'm listening to your description of the issues and what works and what didn't work in 1918. And I'm looking at the Ukraine now, and the same things are working, the same things aren't working, the same lessons are being learned and not being learned. It's really quite amazing.
I agree with you, and I'll just say this. It shows you the value of studying military history, doesn't it?
This has been another in our series of webcasts produced by the Royal Canadian Military Institute in Toronto as a public educational service. You can find news of upcoming events and links to our webcast archives at www.rcmi.org. On behalf of the RCMI, this is Eric Morse saying goodbye for now, and thank you for joining us.